What's up, everybody? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm the Croc Nick, and I am back with a third part to my whole little thing about bands that are heavy, but they're not metal, quote unquote. Or are they? Because I like to play the devil's advocate, and these are, again, a lot of fun to discuss because there's so many bands that are kind of like outliers. They have a unique sort of heavy sound that kind of fits in with metal, kind of doesn't. It's always kind of like, debatable in terms of where they belong in terms of the whole metal spectrum. And once again, I have another interesting batch of bands that I think are worthy of discussion in terms of this. And I'm including some proto-metal bands here. Some bands like more from the 70s era that may have been bands that sort of ushered in a more metallic sound but weren't necessarily metal themselves, and believe me, there's a lot of them. I probably could have done this whole segment about proto-metal bands, but I wanted to pepper some in here just to sort of mix it up a bit because I feel like I've focused a lot on the 90s, which, the 90s are definitely going to get brought up again. And again, it was a very experimental period in music, and I think that also is showcased in a lot of 70s stuff too. But yeah, I figured the proto-metal discussion would kind of spice this up a little bit. But first, we are actually going to talk about a band that, would probably fit in that subcategory if they had been around in the 70s, but they were a 90s band that definitely had a interesting retro sound. We're going to talk about Monster Magnet. Now, my first exposure with this band was more than likely when the song Space Lord dropped. That was a huge hit for the band, and it was all over the radio, and I was quick to label them a metal band. I saw a picture of them. They're all wearing like leather, long hair. A lot of the, music publications were calling them a metal band. Mostly, again, the, bigger ones like Rolling Stone, Spin, etc. The ones that weren't like metal-centric. I went out, I got the album Power Trip. I really dug it. I still really dig that album. And then as I started getting more of their stuff, I started to kind of waver more on me like classifying them as a metal band because a lot of their stuff, while, Black Sabbath and like Deep Purple and stuff like that are big influences on their sound, and they do have a heavier sound overall. A lot of their stuff is also very acid rock inspired. Like, this band is a huge fan of Hawkwind. And that sound was definitely showcased more in songs like Tab, which is like a 32-minute space rock, kind of noisy, psychedelic, trippy, just weird song. Like, honestly, it's kind of hard to get into. Like, off of that EP, I particularly like Long Hair because it's just sort of a, more pleasant kind of, melody-driven psychedelic jam, but, Tab itself is just sort of a nuts song, loaded with weird vocal loops and spacey sound effects and, like, theremins and weird guitar loops. And this band has even covered Hawkwind in the past. They covered Brainstorm, was on their album Super Judge, which is also a very psychedelic but more riff-oriented album. When it came down to the band being a little bit more straightforward heavy, it was probably Dopes to Infinity was the one that kind of, maybe veered more into metal territory. Songs like Look to Your Orb for the Warning, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, which, yes, Marvel Comics definitely took the name of that character from this band. And speaking of Marvel Comics, Ego the Living Planet, which is an absolutely riffy monster of a track on that album as well. This album in particular kind of brought forth like a heavier guitar tone overall, and it's kind of an interesting thing with this band because the sound of this band, or at least like guitar tone wise, it would change from album to album. Like if you go back to Spine of God, the guitar tone is way more fuzzy and raw. Like it's a very analog sounding, just kind of crackly sound. Like, something you would hear more in like Iron Butterfly or something like that. As much as there's a ton of 70s rock worship in Monster Magnet, there's a lot of stuff that kind of touches on like the late 60s as well, where music was kind of transitioning out of like, the more straightforward like Beatles, just pop rock songs that, were absolutely fundamental in terms of like influencing music across the board. But when music started getting more experimental and more weird and more about like the counterculture thing, like this band kind of screamed that. Like they weren't like heavy in terms of like how we describe heavy music now in terms of like just like big meaty riffs and blah, blah, blah. It was also kind of a mix of that whole heavy, like, what you would hear a stereotypical hippie say in a movie. At their, like, fuzziest and droniest, I'm sure you could probably lump them in with stoner rock. It's kind of an odd fit because, again, there's a lot more going on in their sound. and it didn't necessarily sound like, your flat out Caius worship band. But conversely, I feel like, at least, in terms of marketing, they tried to push them more towards the grunge crowd too, or the post-grunge crowd, because they knew how to write like a good riffy hook that was just more of a flat out, just straight up rocker. Now, Power Trip was definitely sort of a shift in their sound overall. Like if you compare Power Trip to Super Judge, which was the album before it, they feel very different. Power Trip is more about riffs and hooks. It's less about the stony atmosphere. I mean, sure, the lyrics are weird, but all of Dave Windorf's lyrics are weird. He's a weird dude. He likes to reference all sorts of like crazy stuff, and I do love his affinity for comics. Even on God Says No, there's a whole line on the opening track Melt where he says the whole world should have cried the day Jack Kirby died. And me being a big comic book fan, I was like, dude, that's pretty sweet. But after Power Trip, there was definitely a period where they were writing a little bit more accessible songs. There were more straight up rockers. They kind of lost that psychedelic edge. But they were always consistently like on the heavier side. Like even at their most relaxed, there's still like this sort of like heaviness to their sound overall. And slowly but surely they started working their way back to the more psychedelic sound. Like the Lost Patrol in particular, I think is kind of a return to like the whole Super Judge thing. And this band, again, it just has like flat out heavy riffs, but it's just kind of different. It's a lot of like psychedelic stuff, and I feel like that's the main gear rather than, being like riffy and heavy in a metal sense. So, when it comes down to like calling this band a metal band, well, I mean, first off, they're not in the archives. That's, of course, always a theme on these videos. But I kind of feel like this band is kind of like spread out in like some different camps, and it's kind of a homogenization of different styles that comes together with, like big rock hooks, the psychedelic vibes. And, it does kind of flirt with the whole stoner rock thing, or stoner rock versus stoner metal. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. I would say maybe certain albums have a little bit more of a metal vibe to them overall. But, I mean, as far as calling this band a metal band across the board, I don't know. It just doesn't feel right. I think they are kind of content just being, the weird kind of retro, psychedelic, twisted band that Monster Magnet is. And you know what? I'm totally fine with that. So I said I was going to go into some proto metal, and this next one up, I have been actually just waiting to talk about because I've been a long time fan of them. We're going to talk about Thin Lizzy. In terms of classic 70s rock bands that have had a huge impact on metal overall, that aren't necessarily metal bands, Thin Lizzy is near the top of the list. When you break down this band's sound to a lot of its signature elements, there are so many tropes that are repeated in metal today. And I mean, honestly, some of the stuff that they did, I would say, pioneered at least the whole new wabam scene. Namely, a heavier guitar tone with a little bit more beef to it. The twin guitar harmonies is probably the biggest one because twin guitar harmonies were such a signature thing in Thin Lizzy. You can hear them on virtually any song, but I mean, like, Bad Reputation, Killer Without a Cause, Emerald, Don't Believe a Word. I mean, there's too many for me to actually list here because like that was such a signature thing. That and the more galloped rhythms. And it's almost to a point where if you just added like a little bit more chug to the guitars and turned that, kind of like classic rock gallop into more of a heavy metal gallop with like, a double bass pedal, you would get a metal song. Brian Downey's drums alone, like the fact that he liked more up-tempo rhythms, and he did do a lot of double bass work, at least, for the time. Like, double bass wasn't super prevalent back then, but he did pepper it in a lot. It just wasn't always in the gallops. Now, Thin Lizzy formed around the same time as bands like the Scorpions and Judas Priest, and while they definitely have a lot of, like, common ground in terms of, like, the music they wrote, the tone for Scorpions and Judas Priest was notably different. I'm not talking like guitar tone, just the tone of their music. Judas Priest, at least, probably like second album on, started embracing more darker themes. It was a little bit more sinister sounding. And then kind of the same thing with Scorpions too. Thin Lizzy didn't get off the ground with like a flat out heavier sound. They kind of started off as more of just like like just kind of a hooky rock band, like their self-titled album and Nightlife in particular. A lot of the songs are a little bit lighter. Like, yeah, they do have like a good energy to them, but they didn't have like this more raucous sound, which would come on later in albums like Jailbreak, Johnny the Fox, Black Rose, Bad Reputation, which is a personal favorite of mine. That album's got riffs for days. And while earlier albums like Vagabonds of the Western World definitely flirted with some heavier material, I didn't feel like it became a more consistent thing until a little bit later in their career. But again, when it came down to the tone of the music and the themes, the songs, it didn't necessarily scream heavy metal. Like, yes, you had big, raucous, high-energy bruisers. They were a little bit more, kind of in your face and edgy, but I mean, Phil Lynott liked to write a lot of love songs. Like, he could craft like a good, heavy song, and at the same time, and often on the same album, the next track could be like this very lovely, pleasant, very bright sounding, melody with a big, kind of sappy hook to it. And I mean, honestly, if you're a Thin Lizzy fan, you kind of loved both sides of this band. So while you could say a lot of their heavier material definitely, influenced a lot of metal, their, more sappy, heartfelt side, which was also cool. I like that too. That side of the band in particular kind of keeps them out of the metal conversation kind of overall, because I wouldn't consider Thin Lizzy a metal band. I would consider them a great band and highly influential to metal just because of the specific dynamics that they brought in terms of songwriting that was just heavily taken from this band and used to great effect. That, at least puts them in the discussion in terms of like metal's evolution. And the guitar work alone in Thin Lizzy will probably always put them in the conversation. Scott Gorham, Gary Moore, Snowy White, John Sykes, who was on the pretty underrated Thunder and Lightning. Dude, I mean, there are like flat out metal riffs scattered all throughout their discography that I would say even a music fan couldn't objectively argue weren't influential to heavy metal overall. Now, their later material definitely pushed a little bit more towards the metal side. Again, Thunder and Lightning definitely had a heavier vibe to it. The guitar tone had a little bit more crunch to it. Cold Sweat, that song has just got an absolutely killer riff in it that is, I would say, 100% metal. But overall, I wouldn't call this band a metal band. They're just an awesome rock band. I mean, a lot of the stuff still kind of rooted in blues rock. A lot of their drum patterns are kind of like just sped up blues shuffles. And if anything, I would say this band is a like transitional bridge from rock to metal. They weren't quite there yet, but they were building their way across to this whole metal thing. And then, the next bands that kind of picked up on what they were doing definitely took it and rolled with it. And I mean, honestly, I don't think we'd have, bands like Iron Maiden doing all the flashy guitar harmonies without Thin Lizzy's influence. So yeah, Thin Lizzy, I'm not going to argue that they're a metal band. I don't think they are, but overall, their influence to metal is absolutely huge. And that's going to lead us into this next one, which also has had a huge impact on metal. And again, another band that I don't necessarily think was, but again, they kind of got lumped in that crowd, and that is Blue Oyster Cult. I have been attached to this band since I was a wee little lad because my ma listened to Blue Oyster Cult a ton. It's one of her favorite bands. It's still one of her favorite bands. And actually the songs that I heard the most, or probably the songs most people have heard the most by Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper and Godzilla. Now, me being a Godzilla fan since I was a kid as well, the fact that there was a song called Godzilla and it had like one of the most iconic riffs I think I've ever heard, oh my god, that made me absolutely ecstatic, and legit, it's still like one of my favorite songs by this band. But as I got like more into their music and started getting more of their albums, again, that sort of heavy metal vibe didn't necessarily fit, but it kind of did. I remember like a lot of publications, again, calling Blue Oyster Cult a metal band. And then reading interviews with the band years later, they said, like, well, the metal thing really never fit for us. We're not a heavy metal band, but that's kind of where we kind of fit in because we were kind of this weird counterculture band. All our lyrics are very weird. Like, they had a lot of them written by different poets and such, and different lyricists for other bands. So they had this sort of strange vibe to them, but that kind of put them on the fringe of like your more straightforward rock bands out there that were, I wouldn't say like clean cut, but they were a little bit more straight ahead. These guys were strange. They like to experiment. I would say like a good chunk of their albums, you could argue that there's a lot of progressive elements to them. And I think because this band had a sound that was hard to peg and an image that was, again, like just a little weird, like they all seemed like they would kind of like dress different, and Buck Dharma had his very strange like Swiss cheese guitar, or as he called it, stun guitar, which I don't know, I just think that's just kind of a cool term. I think when it came down to marketing this band, they kind of pushed them more towards, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, which were definitely heavier bands, and at points I would argue were heavier than Blue Oyster Cult. And then later, as bands like Judas Priest and Scorpion started taking off a little bit more, we're going to try to nudge it towards that group as well. The imagery, the sound, the song structure, the themes of their music, that on a surface level probably fit in a little bit more with, the metal crowd because, we're weird. We like weird songs about weird things, and that was something that Blue Oyster Cult definitely specialized in. And some of their earlier songs definitely had some more metallic moments, or at least moments that were a little bit heavier than your standard rock songs. Hot Rails to Hell, Cities on Flame with Rock and Roll, the bridge on Don't Fear the Reaper, I think that's still super heavy. Seven Screaming Dizbusters, which is just sort of a wild, weird song, and I'm still not entirely sure what it's about. But it definitely had some heavier moments, and of course Godzilla, I would say, a lot of stoner metal bands probably just listen to that riff and was like, dude, we're going to base an entire sound on that. Well, that and, of course, Black Sabbath. So, yeah, we're going to dry hump most of Black Sabbath's earlier catalog and then Godzilla. This band, even in the late 70s and early 80s, actually formed a relationship with one Martin Birch, famed Iron Maiden producer, so that gives them, a little bit of metal cred. And honestly, two of the albums that they did with him, which I believe were the only two albums they did with him, Cultosaurus Erectus and Fire of Unknown Origin, are possibly two of my favorites. In fact, I will probably say that Fire of Unknown Origin is my favorite, and it kind of has probably the most metal vibes of any of their albums. Now, while, again, I don't think this band is necessarily a metal band, this was probably the furthest they pushed into that territory. And it was done with some intention because I believe a lot of these songs were intended to be the score for Heavy Metal, the original animated movie, which only one track would actually make that soundtrack, Veteran of the Psychic Wars, which is a fantastic song, and I love the heavy synths and, big riffs on there. It's just an absolutely fantastic song, but a good chunk of these songs have, again, more metallic riffs, especially Vengeance the Pact. The guitar harmonies on that song, especially towards the end where it picks up pace and gets into the kind of almost Iron Maiden gallop, that might be, again, one of the heaviest moments this band had. But overall, again, this is a band that I wouldn't necessarily consider metal despite having some more metal moments. They're kind of Queens of the Stone Age's relationship to metal. They definitely have their metal moments, but they never solely kind of fit under the metal umbrella entirely. And that had a lot to do with their output never being consistently metal. You'd have a heavier track here, and then you'd have a very strange one here, and a more ballady track, and a big single in the next one. The songs could be wildly different from one another, but I think that's also the appeal with this band, and still, strangely enough, this band in particular, in terms of classic rock bands, seems to appeal to metalheads more. When it comes down to most of the metalheads I know, if we start talking about classic 70s rock, of course, yeah, we're going to talk about Black Sabbath because duh. But Blue Oyster Cult often comes up, and I think the thing that really appeals to metalheads when it comes down to this band is the experimentation, the weird songwriting, the fact that they were just sort of this strange, aloof band that talked about dark and spooky subjects, but also had an air of fun to them. In terms of classic rock, you could argue that they were a bit heavier, but I would still say they were a few steps down from Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and maybe even Thin Lizzy to a degree. They were accessible, but accessible in a way to people that wanted music to be a little bit more challenging and a little bit more strange. And that in itself, I think, appeals to metalheads in general because metal is often rather challenging. And metal bands frequently love to cover this band. So, yeah, I don't think they're metal. They got some metal moments. I absolutely love this band. I still need to patch up the holes in my discography for Blue Oyster Cult. Believe me, I went looking when I was down in Florida for the albums I was missing. I had no luck there. But yeah, overall, Blue Oyster Cult, awesome band, influential to metal, but not quite metal. Next up, I think this is a band we can definitely argue is hugely influential to metal and possibly, a band you could argue is metal in a way, and that band is Van Halen. Point blank, Eddie Van Halen might be one of the most influential guitarists to metal that wasn't necessarily metal. I think he probably inspired more, metal dudes to pick up a guitar, find that crunchy tone, and, just embody being the lead guitarist. Eddie was that guy. He was a fucking enigma. His tone, his persona, the way his guitar looked and sounded, I would say, like, he was probably one of the first, like, guitar gods out there that just, he had a different sort of vibe than, like, previous lead guitarists before him. Like, no disrespect to, like, Ritchie Blackmore, Tony Iommi, Jimi Hendrix, like, any of those guys. There was just something different about Eddie Van Halen, and his presence, his writing, his guitar work ushered in a whole new sound. Like, this was the evolution from, like, that 70s more kind of like warm, kind of fuzzy, heavy tone to this big old crunch that honestly is still being used today, and is probably the most influential tone across heavy music in terms of like getting that crunch started. Van Halen found a way to take like those straight up rock riffs, and with that additional crunchy heavy tone and those insane leads with all the crazy tapping, they took songs that, without that sort of like extra heft to them, they would probably come off as like, just solid rockers. But with that additional heft to it, they kind of got punched up a notch. And again, like, this band kind of changed the whole like heavy music landscape when they came in. And for the record, I'm not going to talk about like Van Hagar. Like, that era is just, it's not for me. If you love it, you love it. If you don't, then, well, we can talk. I'm talking about like the early run of Van Halen albums with Diamond Dave, who even Diamond Dave kind of changed around things in terms of like a frontman's persona. He was a showman. He was out front. He was loud and proud, and he would more than likely try to fuck your girlfriend. He was kind of difficult to work with, but again, you have these giant personalities in this band, and I think that just kind of like made them like a bigger band. Like, in terms of like the term arena rock, I don't know if I heard that term used before Van Halen. But that, combined with an insanely tight rhythm section, this band, it had like, those straightforward hooks that I think anyone could get, but it also had this like additional kind of like sleazy, heavy energy that, well, I would say definitely the whole glam rock scene fed off of. In fact, like, Van Halen was the teat that whole LA scene probably suckled throughout their entire existence, which, I mean, all right, the glam rock scene kind of still exists, even despite Motley Crue's attempts to destroy the legacy of that whole scene. Van Halen was probably the band that really ushered that in. Image-wise, they were flashier, they were brighter. But again, we're going to get back to the guitars, because the guitar work is the thing that I think you can make more of that metal argument about. You strip it out, and again, you have these, heavier songs. Like, I'm sure if you put like a Thin Lizzy tone on top of that, these songs would still probably sound really awesome. But it's that additional heft and the fact that, Eddie had these big, heavy, chuggy riffs. Ain't Talking About Love, Unchained, Loss of Control. There's so many of these like flat out heavier songs that, border on metal probably more closely than any other proto metal band. And I think, this band is where you can kind of like maybe take the proto off, because it's not necessarily like the forming blocks anymore. I think like the foundation of metal by the time Van Halen had come around was pretty much already there. But this band was also still adding to the evolution of the sound too. Now, in terms of the bands that I'm going over on here, I would say that this band might be the most popular band on the list. Like, they kind of eclipsed just the rock fans, because their fans were all over the place, because, well, this band had hits everywhere, so you attracted people from all walks of life. So when it came down to like the whole fan base being like a more like heavy metal centric crowd or like hard rock centric crowd, it wasn't always that. These guys knew how to write just like brilliant pop hooks. So the fan base was kind of wide ranging, but when it came down to, the fans that wanted heavier music and were really kind of feeding off of what this band was doing, they took what this band had and built on it. I mean, Dimebag Darrell was one of the biggest Van Halen fans out there, and was very much a student of Eddie Van Halen, down to the playing, the tone, but he added something else to it and made it more heavy and more just flat out metal centric. But Eddie's influence, his touch on heavy guitars, is across the board in metal. So as for this band being a metal band, man, like, again, like, certain songs really sound more metal centric, and then other songs, a little bit more rock centric. And then again, the Van Hagar period, it's just adult contemporary radio with the occasional riff. I mean, there's a couple of good tunes, I'll be honest, but most of it's pretty ignorable. But this early run of albums, man, like it's tough for me to call it metal, but it's also tough for me to not say that it is really close. Like if we were doing like a gradient scale or something like that, it would be like kind of like just below Black Sabbath as far as like being a metal band, which I mean, Black Sabbath is even debatable too, which I thought about throwing them on this list, and who knows, I might, just because, well, I mean, a lot of people argue that they're proto-metal too, but a lot of people like me will argue that they're the first metal band. But yeah, Van Halen, I don't know, pretty damn close to metal, but again, I don't necessarily think they quite are. I don't know, it's kind of that same thing as like Thin Lizzy. Like there are so many elements in their sound that influence metal overall that you could really make that argument, but I mean, if you break down their music, it's not entirely metal. So yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and say, yeah, they're not a metal band, but I don't know, like in terms of hard rock, like they're, again, so close to kind of like jumping that fence into metal territory at some point. So yeah, either way, jam some Van Halen, especially the early stuff. The early stuff is still absolutely golden. All right, so the next band up is a band that I want to talk about because they kind of fit in with this whole proto-metal thing, even though they are a more recent band, honestly. But they're so retro that, honestly, if you played them side by side with some of the other acts that I've brought up here, you would assume that they just kind of crept out of a tomb in the 70s and just wanted to spook everyone. And that band is The Devil's Blood. And I know what you're thinking, a name like that kind of screams metal. I mean, look at their logo. It looks like a metal logo. Look at their debut EP album cover. You would think that that is a metal album, and you would have been bait and switched because it is more along the lines of like occult rock, proto-metal, like again, elements of Thin Lizzy, Black Sabbath, maybe even Blue Oyster Cult too, but also very sonically aligned with bands like Witchcraft, Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats, and Graveyard, which two of those bands are in the archives, and this band is not, even though like thematically, image-wise, everything across the board, this band screams metal band, but sonically, it might not be just there because while it is heavy, it is a 70s rock heavy. Overall, all their songs have this very spooky, very like, I don't know, like 70s hammer horror-esque sort of thing. Like the band overall looks the part of a metal band. Their frontwoman, Freda, would constantly have like blood dripping off of her, like, very much like Carrie. And that combined with her very haunting, sultry vocals, everything about this band's sound, image, aura is dark, but maybe not explicitly a metal dark. Occult rock kind of fits in with a little bit more of that like kind of retro 70s rock sound, like, bands like, again, like Graveyard. You could throw in like Rival Sons in there too. Bands that just want to latch onto that 70s sound in general. These are bands that want to latch on that sound, but also want to make sure it sounds dark and doomy, like Witchfinder General, or maybe just like a touch of early Merciful Fate kind of peppered in there. Even the riff work, well, I would say it definitely borders on bands like, Thin Lizzy or Scorpions. Like you got a lot of just beautiful but haunting guitar harmonies and leads and melodies. There's just something a little bit more dark and sinister about it, where it isn't necessarily about like just like the big rock hooks and it's, fun. It's, there to get you moving. It's also there to kind of like, like create a mood, create an atmosphere. Now I got in this band knowing that they weren't a metal band, even though when I saw the album cover, I was like, this looks like doom metal. But I got through my buddy who has a record shop and he was playing it in the background as I was, surfing around looking for whatever metal that had come out. And I asked about it because one song in particular that he was jamming, which is the song Christ or Cocaine, which might be my favorite song by this band, it instantly reminded me of old Scorpions. Like that song could have been plucked right off of probably Taken by Force. Like it just has that sort of groove, that sort of like riff. It's a very straightforward 4/4 time song, and it is driven by some amazing vocal hooks and killer guitar harmonies. This did not scream anything new, but it wasn't. It was brand new at the time. It was their album, The Time of No Time Evermore, which is kind of a mouthful, and I bought it. I jammed the hell out of it. And this was around that same time that Ghost was coming up with their first album. And they kind of, locked in a little bit there. Like, they were very similar, even though I would say Ghost, at least at that point, had maybe a little bit more of a metal edge. Like, the guitar tone on The Time of No Time Evermore isn't like a full-on metal tone. Like, it's definitely heavy, it's definitely kind of fuzzy, but it doesn't have like a very metallic crunch to it. But the vibe was very similar. And honestly, if it weren't for the, tragic history of this band, which I'll get into, I think this band probably would have been like kind of in lockstep with Ghost. Maybe not like stylistically in terms of changing the sound, but in terms of embodying that like kind of near metal, proto metal sort of sound that I think both bands kind of exude, at least at that point in Ghost's career. Maybe a better comparison would be Uncle Ass and the Deadbeats, because this band has just a fiercely analog sound. Like, it doesn't sound like it is overproduced and trying to sound like absolutely huge and like a big, I wouldn't say like pop sense, but like a big modern rock sense. In fact, nothing about this band sounds modern. Everything is very much a throwback to like the 70s or even the late 60s overall. And the songs are just absolutely infectious in terms of just melodies, hooks, great choruses, but it maintains that sort of like dark vibe throughout, which I think kind of makes it appeal to metalheads more. In fact, I don't think I've ever run into a person that was a fan of this band that wasn't a metalhead in some way. And that, again, might have something to do with, like, image-wise. Like, again, they looked the part. Their album covers had a more dark look to them, especially that first EP. But even their later albums, it doesn't necessarily look like, just like a flat-out rock band's album covers. It looks like it has something more dark and sinister and kind of occultish to it. So that kind of draws in the metalheads. And while I would say like it is kind of like a bait and switch in a way, metalheads weren't getting completely duped by this band. You could still hear kind of that classic proto-metal sound. Like, it wasn't as though like they bought it and it sounded like Breaking Benjamin or something like that. It sounded like something very classic and something that would, again, like fit in with like a lot of that early heavy metal sound, just, a few steps before it. So as for this band being a metal band, sonically, no, but I mean, it is kind of close, but it's, again, more of that occult rock vibe. And pretty much if you wanted a rock band to get as close to metal as possible in terms of their imagery, their art, and, just sort of their themes in general, but not go full bore metal, this is your band, because they get as close as possible and still kind of just retain all those like just clever rock hooks. But again, it's dark, it's sinister, and honestly, all of their music is amazing. I love all their albums. Sadly, their principal songwriter and guitarist and Farida's brother, sadly, unalived himself. I hate saying that term because it's stupid, but I guess it keeps YouTube off my back. And after that, the band chose to be no more. Now, Farida is continuing on in terms of like doing more vocal work and has another band called Molasses, which is not nearly as dark and sinister as this band, and honestly kind of like leans a little bit closer to like, 70s prog rock, but I think it's still really good. While her brother's riff work and just knack for melody really define this band's work, her vocals are absolutely amazing. They're just like the icing on the cake. She sounds like she could, just deliver a flat out giant rock, kind of like almost poppy hook, and then conduct an evil sermon in maybe the next breath. This band may be like a little bit more obscure, but if you have not checked them out, I strongly recommend it. If you're a big fan of like early Scorpions and Witchcraft and, again, like Uncle Ass and the Deadbeats, check this band out. Everything they did, I think, was pretty much remarkable. All right, next up, we are getting more into prog / avant-garde / I don't know, this band's kind of hard to describe overall. We're going to talk about the Mars Volta. Now, I'm still a pretty big fan of At the Drive-In. I think they're just a really cool, like, I guess, like, hardcore punk. I don't know. They're kind of hard to describe, but I'm an even bigger fan of the Mars Volta because this band pushed into some absolutely weird territory in terms of progressive rock. Their sound was dense, complex, weird, lots of strange transitions, and I don't know if I would necessarily call it metallic, but it was loud, it was intense, it was bombastic and explosive, and a lot of other adjectives that I would use to describe a lot of other metal acts. I would say the foundation of the Mars Volta in terms of their sound is kind of like a 50-50 split between, 70s prog rock, like stuff like Yes, King Crimson, and maybe like Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And then again, they're like more punk and hardcore roots kind of mashed up. And then everything else starts swirling around that sort of like nexus at the center. And this band kind of just got stranger and stranger with each release. Now, I got into them with their debut full-length Deloused the Comatarium, which I think is honestly probably their best piece of work. I heard so many people talk about how just absolutely bonkers this album was. And this was around the time that like System of a Down had like really kind of broken out, and people were like, man, this band is like strange, like listen to those weird vocals, and like I don't know entirely what this band's doing. And, in hindsight, like, I mean, maybe at the time it was, kind of like, wow, that's really weird. And now, because we've been exposed to it for years, System of a Down, just like, well, it's System of a Down. But with Mars Volta, I don't think I ever went, well, it's just Mars Volta. Because every album was some strange psychedelic whirlwind of just bizarre songwriting and some absolutely impressive musicianship. Now, while the guitars I wouldn't say were, very metallic sounding, but because of the progressive nature of their music, they would go just every which way they possibly could, like shifting over to like more punky, distant, squawky tones to, clean, progressive passages to just some flat out beefy rock riffs. Like one of my favorite songs by this band is their song Viscera Eyes off of their album Amputecture. And that song just has like a flat out kind of like fun rock groove with like touches of salsa and Latin percussion. That stuttered kick groove and that main riff on that song is absolutely infectious. And it's just one of their flat out more like straightforward, heavier tones. And again, while I wouldn't necessarily say it has like a metallic sort of vibe to it, it's definitely heavy. And there's one thing certain about this band in terms of like their style and their approach to music is layers. Everything is just very dense with layers of sound, whether it's multi-tracked vocals with weird pitch shifting in it, horn sections, tons of layered guitars, funky bass lines, and loads of percussion. Again, not necessarily like you're very metallic drumming, like you're not getting like a ton of blast beats or anything like that, but in terms of like the attack on the drum kit, you can almost kind of feel like a metal energy, and that is kind of despite which drummer they had, because they've had multiple drummers, and I mean, all of them are awesome. I think you have to be an awesome musician to actually play in this band. Everything about this band was heavy in some sense, I would say, too. Like, because there's just so much going on. And their penchant for frequent experimentation and non-traditional song structures, like, that's the kind of stuff that, again, appeals to metalheads to some degree, because, again, we're kind of like outsider music. We experiment. We like to do stuff that is like atypical, and this band really went for a lot of atypical stuff. To a degree, I would say like metal embraces a fearlessness when it comes down to like song structure and, again, experimentation, and this band embodies that in a level that, again, it's not purely metallic, but it's heavy, it's loud, it's absolutely intense as hell. And the fact that this band is kind of its own thing, like it's so weird that it has like sort of a niche sort of vibe to it. Like, Voivod. Voivod is an absolutely odd, strange metal band, and I love the shit out of them. And that is kind of part of the reason they don't sound like anyone else, and they do things that are exclusive to them. Mars Volta does a lot of that too. Now, overall, I would say, like, if I had to pick a type of metalhead that would probably latch on to the Mars Volta a bit more, it would be progressive metalheads, like the ones that want like the technical, lavish, drawn-out songs with lots of different movements. That is definitely what Mars Volta does. But in terms of like Mars Volta's relationship to metal, in terms of where they stand, it's kind of like Queens of the Stone Age relationship to stoner metal. Like, yeah, they kind of fit in certain key moments in their career, but they're kind of like an outside band from that entire sound. Same thing with Mars Volta. There's definitely moments where I would say that they have, more progressive metal leanings, like the Bedlam and Goliath definitely has a lot of heavier moments on it. And the same thing with Deloused the Comatorium, and like the whole back half of Francis the Mute is just absolutely nuts. But again, I don't think there's enough of it to say like, yeah, you can kind of come across the line to like progressive metal it's not quite there. Like, it's still, again, in the progressive rock camp, and then whatever other camp that this band wants to try to, fit in, which seem to be a lot of them. Now, at some point, I'm going to go over Sparta and At the Drive-In because those are closely related to this band, but honestly, the Mars Volta is probably my favorite of the three. And I think out of the three, this is the band that might appeal to metalheads a little bit more, especially the avant-garde metal fans, because, it's just sort of a strange sounding band. And, there's stuff on here that I'd say might be kind of comparable to like Psy in some degrees, like just in terms of like, you don't know where it's going to go next. But as far as calling this band a metal band, it's such a small fraction of their sound that I just couldn't flat out do it. Like, it's heavy, it's intense, it's bonkers and experimental. And I'm saying all of this ignoring their last album, which I just did not like at all because it was just a bunch of watered down, like, kind of pop rock songs. I don't know. It sucked. But pretty much everything else I dig by this band, and I recommend checking them out if you haven't. It's a weird trip in terms of doing a dive on this band's discography, but trust me, just check it out. This band is absolutely bonkers. All right, next up, we're going to get away from like the proto metal stuff or retro rock stuff for a little bit, and we are going to talk about some noise rock, and we're going to talk about a band that I know a lot of people have brought up for me to talk about on here, and that band is Unsane. This band might be the reason why I know what noise rock is. They are veterans of the scene. They even have ties to bands like Swans, which was a band that I didn't want to go over here, but I actually want to get some of their stuff. But Unsane, I'm definitely familiar with because I've been listening to this band for years. I remember coming across, I think it was their video for Scrape that was on MTV. It was probably like 120 minutes. It might have been Headbangers Ball. I'm not entirely sure. It was a long time ago, and well, it's been a long time since MTV ever played music videos. In fact, I'm still shocked that channel even exists or just hasn't gotten rid of the M in their logo because, I don't know, it's bullshit. Anyway, I came across their video. I believe it was the Scrape video because I think that was the one that was just like shots of the band in a dark room and then lots and lots of footage of skaters just completely biffing it. And I kind of enjoyed that thing at the time anyway. I mean, it was kind of a precursor to binge watching fail videos. But at this point, I was already into stuff like Helmet and Quicksand, and I was just starting to get into Today Is the Day. And this band kind of lurked somewhere between Helmet and Today Is the Day because while they had that kind of like groove and that more like kind of like post-hardcore-ish vibe that Helmet had, they were also heavier, a lot grittier. And this band knew how to utilize feedback as like part of the music. Like, it wasn't just like this added flavor, like these sliding, squawky riffs and like, feedback loops always seemed to be part of the songs themselves, which were just absolute beatdowns. The songs themselves, simple, heavy, but not an implicitly metal heavy, like more of a hardcore heavy. But it really kind of never left that groovy pocket. Like, it kind of stayed, pretty mid-tempo, but, there was just like this bludgeoning force to the music itself. Now, I didn't get any of their stuff until much later. In fact, I just got the Lamb House collection, which is like a collection of almost all of their earlier albums. And I sat back and jammed and was like, man, I need to get more of this band stuff because it's just absolutely visceral. Like, everything about this band's sound absolutely snarls. Like, the guitars sound, again, squawky and kind of sizzly. The bass is almost percussive. Like, they're actually punching the strings on the bass rather than plucking them. And the vocals in particular I really liked because they had this like kind of like broken PA sort of filter over them. They were harsh bellows and they sounded very anguished and tormented as well as just being, just pissed off. And all this came together in a package that like right away, I kind of knew it really wasn't metal, but it was definitely something that spoke to like my love of just heavy music in general. Like, this didn't have like, like a metal vibe at all. Like, everything about this screamed like CBGB, dirty fucking venues with blood and teeth and urine, like kind of all over the floors and shit, and like super sketchy crowd and, kind of a rough PA system. Like, it was that sort of like underground aesthetic. And while that definitely can describe like a lot of metal, it felt more close to punk and hardcore, but it was that kind of like, dirty underbelly of like punk and hardcore, like almost kind of the stuff that you'd hear like, you know, crust punk embrace, or like the more punky aspects of like certain sludge bands. At very few points in all the albums I own, which I own a fair amount of Unsane's albums, I really wouldn't describe a lot of the riff work as very metallic. Like, it could kind of be compared to like more meat and potatoes death metal, where like it's just based on like a simple riff that repeats a lot, but it's how they play it. It's got a different energy to it. It's very angsty. It's very in your face. Songs like Empty Cartridge, Sick, Dead Weight. Like, these songs just have simple but lethal riffs. And, you know, kind of the cool thing about noise rock in general is it's very minimalistic, but it's very focused, and it's distilled down to its most raw, ugly elements, and it delivers just, you know, flat out just disgusting heft that has the subtlety of a nuke. But on the same token, it can also be like kind of uniquely catchy. Like, you know, this band is definitely tied to Swans, though I would say like this is more stripped down and more focused on the heavy, where Swans, there's definitely a lot of heavy stuff, but that band is, from what I've listened to, very experimental and really hard to pigeonhole. And again, one that I definitely want to bring up on here, I just need way more experience with. But they both do a cool thing with like layers of noise. Like, there's layers of dissonance and squawking, and again, like sort of like static hiss to a lot of their stuff. And it can be uniquely catchy. One album in particular I think kind of stands out a little bit just because I feel like it's a little bit hookier, but it doesn't sacrifice any heft, is Visqueen. Honestly, out of all the albums that I own by the band, that one might be my favorite, just because it balances out some, you know, more like straightforward like Helmet style riffs with their more noisy sound, with of course Unsane's, you know, just love of noise, dissonance, and squawkiness, and just flat out aggression. It's really just sort of like a perfect blend of just layers and layers of heavy, but, you know, the songs are a little bit more memorable because a lot of their songs, again, very simple, very focused, very groove-laden, but the grooves themselves are, you know, kind of like off time, and they're just angrier than shit. And to be very primal and vicious like that while still crafting some like good memorable hooks in there, I think is, you know, a testament to their songwriting ability. Now, as far as calling this band a metal band, I mean, I would say this is one of the heaviest bands on this list for damn sure, and heavy describes everything that this band has delivered. Like, this is sonically vicious, but I feel like it still leans a little bit more close to punk and hardcore rather than metal. There's some stuff in here I would say is like, you know, kind of shared territory with sludge metal, I would say. But overall, like, I don't know. I don't know if I could call this band a metal band, but I would say metalheads like this band because, again, this is one of those bands where when I run into fans of this band, they are generally metalheads, or they're just a fan of heavy music in general. Now, sadly, the status of this band is kind of up in the air. I know that at least one of the members is in Human Impact, which is kind of a continuation of Unsane sound. Like, it's definitely in the vein of noise rock, but I don't think it quite hits as hard as Unsane. But I will say, flat out, if you just like heavy music in general, and you're looking for something that, you know, kind of just captures more of a hardcore vibe, but honestly kind of packs a bit of like a metal groove too, check this band out. Check out pretty much any of their albums. The Landhouse Collection is also a really good place to start because you get a lot of their earlier stuff. Again, I don't know if I would call this band metal. There's just a totally different vibe to it, but I would say that they are as heavy as most metal bands, and honestly heavier than some metal bands that I listen to, because, you know, this band's just flat out vicious. So yeah, check them out. Now, this next one is kind of close to Unsane, at least in terms of fan bases and possibly, you know, a lot of overlap. We're going to talk about Refused, Sweden's, I don't know, like, it's kind of hard to describe this band because they've been through a lot of different phases, but I would say punk, hardcore, and post-punk, post-hardcore. This band definitely has kind of its own thing going, and I would say that they kind of had their own thing going almost from the start. Now, I got into this band after I saw the Truly Strange music video for New Noise. I became hooked on that song. It is still just absolutely catching hell. The riffs on there are amazing, and I flat out love this band's drum work across the board. Not long after that, I picked up their third album and breakout album, The Shape of Punk to Come, and I was absolutely blown away by the songwriting, musicianship, the atmosphere, pretty much everything about that album. And the fact that their prediction was right, because pretty much all the tropes on that album, which came out in 1998, ended up repeating like pretty much throughout like the entire Warped Tour age. Like throughout the mid 2000s, there were so many bands that I think aped a lot of stuff from this album, which I found interesting because this album, and especially New Noise, was talking about how punk was becoming more commercial and being played by, more musicians that weren't necessarily rooted in the punk scene and didn't follow the punk ethos and so on. It sounds like an elitist take. It might be an elitist take, but it was kind of an honest take, because not long after that, you saw an influx of bands that weren't necessarily as rooted in punk or hardcore playing punk or hardcore, and naturally it became more commercial. And then you start seeing major labels signing bands like that, and Victory Records took a hard turn over to the whole emo scene, which, man, that kind of just killed that label for me. That's a different discussion. But The Shape of Punk to Come, I absolutely love this album. That was my big introduction to him. And it was strange because I felt like there was enough stuff on there that, it felt very familiar in terms of like a metal vibe, like riff work on there. It was very clever. It wasn't like, straight up like 4-chord punk where it was just play as loud and as fast as you can and, tell the government and your dad how much you don't like them. It was very thought-provoking. The songwriting was very intricate, bordering on progressive at times in terms of like the transitions and the riff work, and the drum work, absolutely fantastic on that. It's just very groove laden, very smooth sounding, but it's got this like sort of like in the pocket sort of flashiness to it that I absolutely love. And I was absolutely like stoked to like, possibly see this band at one point, and then this band kind of had a rocky history, and not long after this came out on their first US tour, they ended up breaking up. I actually have a documentary about it, which is called The Refuse is Fucking Dead, which is the name of one of their songs. It's a fucking awesome song. But yeah, like everything kind of fell apart on the tour and they went into obscurity. So I was left to actually like kind of find their earlier stuff, and I came across their second album, Fanning the Flames of Discontent, which came out on Victory Records. And that is honestly a flat out metallic hardcore album. Like this is probably one of the most metal albums that I will talk about on here, because it just has a metal sound to it. Frequent syncopated, heavy chugging riffs, which honestly weren't as big of a thing on The Shape of Punk to Come. This just has a flat out more metallic sound overall. The guitar tone, the production's more raw. And then as I looked into this band, and I didn't know this about their first album and their follow-up EP actually, was they have a connection to something very metal. Their first album and their follow-up EP were recorded by one Thomas Skogsberg in Sunlight Studios, with the assistance of Fred Edsby. So you have a connection to like the HM2 factory that generated some of my favorite death metal ever. And as like icing on the cake, Fred Edsby did like engineering for him, which, Dismember, awesome. I absolutely love that band. So it's just kind of interesting that they have this connection. And they weren't a metal band. They were a hardcore punk band. Like at that point in their career, I don't think they had a lot of metal elements. In fact, I don't think a lot of that stuff came out really until songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent, which if you put a different vocalist on that album, I think you would have a flat out metal album. Like I think you just need a vocal change and maybe like more lead guitar in there. And honestly, it would sound like, actually kind of like Earth Crisis a little bit, or like early Hatebreed. It sounds like Crusader of Hopelessness, It's Not Okay, Rather Be Dead, Hook, Line, and Sinker. Like you listen to those songs and you will hear an absolute fuck ton of metal riffs. Now, some of that did carry over again to, Shape of Punk to Come, but that album was going in a completely different direction, and honestly still their most ambitious album to date. They brought in elements of jazz, classical music, electronic music, and kind of wove it in their sound, and it became like this just huge album in the underground that everyone was talking about. Now again, they did break up, they did some time in other bands, and then they have recently come back with their last two albums, Freedom and War Music, which I think are good albums. I don't feel like they're like the best continuation of The Shape of Punk to Come. Like they have their moments, they definitely have, again, like, the heavy riffs and like that sort of like nasty punk energy to them. But I feel like, some of that like risk-taking factor in there that was on The Shape of Punk to Come has somewhat disappeared a bit, and the songs are a little bit more straight ahead. But as far as calling this band a metal band, I would say they're more in that punk and hardcore lane. Definitely some deviations, but I'll also say that Songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent is so close to pretty much being a metal album. Bare minimum, it is a flat out metallic hardcore album, and I feel like that's like close enough to metal as is. Like, I still put that in the whole metal umbrella. So maybe that album in particular, I will say is a metal album. But as for the entire band, probably not. But anyway, this band's absolutely amazing, and it's actually great having them back again. I did see that their frontman suffered a heart attack recently. Hopefully he's doing all right, because I'd love a chance to finally see Refused in the future. But yeah, Refused, fantastic band, and I'm glad they're not fucking dead. Next up, we are going to talk about some hardcore, and honestly, another hardcore band that I kind of cut my teeth on back in the 90s, because it was a Victory Records band, and I definitely gone over that label quite a bit, to the point where I think everyone knows that, yeah, early Victory Records stuff was absolutely golden, and probably my biggest influence when it came down to hardcore, and this band is no exception. We are going to talk about some Snapcase. Now, I got in this band around the same time I was getting into bands like Strife, Integrity, Hatebreed, Earth Crisis, etc. Like that early roster of Victory Records bands, just absolutely savage. And Snapcase was one that kind of stood out a little bit, from the rest of the pack. They didn't necessarily fall under the whole metallic hardcore brand. Like, they definitely had heavier riffs, lots of big syncopation grooves, but there was just always something slightly different about them. Their first two albums, I would say, were like kind of just straight ahead hardcore. Looking Glass Self and Progression Through Unlearning, which Progression Through Unlearning I think is probably one of the best hardcore albums that ever came out on Victory Records, and that is saying a lot, because a lot of great hardcore records came out on that label. But whereas, Hatebreed and Earth Crisis and Integrity, they all had like a fierce metal element to them, like to the point where you could really pick it out. Like, yeah, this has that sort of like hardcore punch. It's angry, it's loose, it's violent, but it has like a little bit more of that precision and songwriting maturity that you would hear in metal. This band leaned a little bit more towards the hardcore side, but embraced a lot of groove and alternative. A lot of their material came off like a more snarling version of bands like Helmet, Quicksand, but even, bands like, Deftones, and I would even say Fugazi to a degree. This was hardcore with like sort of a almost like alternative filter over it. And it came across in like a multitude of different ways. Like, one of the big ones is Daryl Taberski's vocals. He didn't necessarily have like that more metallic sound. It wasn't like super gruff. It was more of an agonized bellow and a shout kind of mixed together. It made their music stand out, and musically they had tight grooves. There was a lot of syncopation, but when you listen to the riff work, it doesn't come across as metallic in terms of the playing. Like, there's not a lot of like the whole metal touch to the riff work. Like, you don't hear like the more intricate riff changes that you would get in metallic hardcore and metal. It's a little bit more straightforward, heavy strumming that you would hear in hardcore and punk. But at the same time, it packed this like sort of like Earth Crisis type groove to it. And when it came down to the more melodic or atmospheric aspects to their sound, again, it kind of pushed more towards like alternative, like a lot of heavy atmospheric strumming. And you get that more towards like their later albums like Designs for Automation and End Transmission, both of which I think are really solid albums, but they also kind of employed a little bit more of that straight up kind of like, I guess you could say like alternative rock sort of hook to it, but also still made sure the angst and the aggression was still there. Designs for Automation honestly kind of runs like a heavier Quicksand album. Daryl takes a little bit off his vocals at times and delivers like some more catchy vocal hooks, and it kind of does sound like Walter a little bit at times. Like, if you close your eyes, either way you would still probably hear someone screaming at you, but there's a little bit more like melody and like nuance to the vocals that really wasn't there on the earlier albums, where Daryl was just shouting his guts out. And even lyrically, it didn't necessarily come across as like always that straightforward hardcore aggression. They had a lot of like complex themes. The first song I ever heard by this band was Harrison Bergeron, which is definitely some heady subject matter if you get that reference. But that carried through a lot of their stuff. It was, not just like, I'm angry at this, I'm pissed at that. And that's kind of like the general hardcore thing. You find the thing that you don't like in life and you call it out, and well, if you're Jamie Jost, you find some motivational speech to kind of lift you out of it. Or if you're Carl from Earth Crisis, you talk about how much you don't want to eat meat. But yeah, this band just sounded different from a lot of hardcore bands that were coming out. And as they evolved from album to album, I would say they kind of lost a little bit of the hardcore, but they also embraced a lot of, just different stuff. Like occasionally more synths would come in. You would get some more like almost Radiohead-ish material in there. And I think that added to their sound overall. And while the more alternative side started coming out later in their career, early in their career, you can definitely hear more metal elements. Like the riff on She Suffocates is just flat out brutal. Box Seat, I think, is an absolute, more metallic sounding banger. Yeah, overall, in terms of calling this band a metal band, no, I don't even know if I would really call them a metallic hardcore band, but I would still call them a hardcore band for sure. Even their later material, though it is a little bit more experimental and kind of embraces a little bit more like alternative and, I wouldn't call it necessarily progressive, but the sound became more than just it's one streamlined thing. And I like the fact that this band did, continue to progress as they went on, but sadly did break up in 2003. Either way, another band that I strongly recommend, especially again, if you're a fan of, Helmet and Quicksand and stuff like that. This band is very much in that realm, maybe a little bit heavier and a little bit meaner at times, but just fantastic songwriting and sorely missed. All right, this next one goes way back into my 90s listening as well, and honestly is a recent addition to this list just because we recently went over one of their albums. We're going to talk about Fu Manchu. And there's kind of two main reasons I want to go over this band. Well, three reasons, but one of them is that I absolutely love this band. I've been a fan of them since their album In Search Of, which was a huge album for me in terms of setting me on the path towards stoner rock / stoner metal. But one of the main reasons is while we were going over the last album, Return of Tomorrow, which is really solid once again. This band rarely ever misses when it comes down to doing what they do because they kind of have this one lane they hang out in, and I'm totally fine with it. But anyway, we went over that album, and I realized that they were not on the archives, but at the same time, Caius was, which both these bands are kind of cut from the same cloth, which brings up the second reason. This also brings up that whole difference between stoner metal and stoner rock. And point blank, I will say that Fu Manchu is a little bit more on the stoner rock side overall. And while I would say that about Caius, you can make more arguments about the metal aspects, even though I would probably argue that a lot of their heavier, more metallic stuff, I feel like it's more rooted in the desert punk sound, but that's up for debate. But Fu Manchu just has more of a rock feel. And, that's kind of like the stoner rock thing. Yeah, it's heavy because, guitar tone is kind of key with that whole subset. If you are in a stoner metal band or a stoner rock band or even a stoner doom band, you are kind of by default a tone chaser because that stony, fuzzy guitar tone kind of makes the sound. It's the most distinguished characteristic about stoner rock and stoner metal and stoner doom. You gotta have the right tone. And I would argue that Fu Manchu, throughout their career, just know how to bring that fuzz. It just has that Sabbathy warmth to it. It's one of those guitar tones where it doesn't really matter what kind of music you are playing with it. The melody, the hook, the riff, whatever, it immediately sounds like it couldn't pass a piss test. And that is exactly what Fu Manchu pretty much does to perfection throughout their entire career. And that's pretty much the same thing with Caius as well. They pretty much cater to the same crowd, but somehow Caius gets a little bit more of a metal argument, even though I think they're playing pretty much the same riffs. And they cater to the same crowd. Surfers, skaters, stoners, that's the same people that are checking out both bands, I would say. But again, with stoner rock versus stoner metal, I feel like there's a little bit of a difference. And a lot of it, I think it comes down to how everything is played. With Fu Manchu, everything is loud and fuzzy and stony. And that's to be expected. But when you break down the riffs themselves, they don't really scream metal all the time. This band definitely has their heavier moments where they kind of get down and really chug on the riffs. But for the most part, it's heavy droning and kind of punky strumming with just this monstrous tone on top of it. It may not be the most crunchy, aggressive sounding tone, but it's got some serious heft to it. And with these last three albums that Fu Manchu has released, I really feel like they're kind of going backwards in terms of their catalog. This kind of sounds like, the stuff that I got into with In Search Of, King of the Road, No One Rides for Free, Daredevil. Pretty much a lot of the stuff that helped establish that whole high desert, like stoner rock sound back in the early 90s. And this band has been around for forever. But again, when you break it down and really start listening to the riffs, they really don't come across as metal riffs per se. Honestly, with a different tone, it kind of sounds a little bit closer to Clutch, which, Clutch definitely has its heavier moments too, and I already brought up them. But again, it's not a band I would necessarily consider a metal band. With as like heavy and fuzzy and droney as Fu Manchu gets, it's very relaxing. Like, there's a chill vibe that kind of goes through a lot of their albums, and that's kind of like stoner metal in general. I usually describe it as like heavy music to kind of just relax to. Stoner rock in general kind of fits in just a weird place. Like, if you were to play Fu Manchu for like a diehard metalhead who's, been listening to like death metal and thrash metal, etc. for most of his life and really hasn't like, dove into stoner rock very much, they would probably just say, hey, this just kind of sounds like rock. But at the same time, if you played it for just a straight up rock fan that really hasn't dove very much into metal, they would probably say, like, no, this is definitely metal. This is way too loud, because it's definitely heavier than a lot of like contemporary or modern rock, namely because of the guitar tone, but also the whole vibe of it. Like, it sounds like it is a little bit more adjacent to metal, namely because of the whole Black Sabbath influence on it. I will say that they do have heavier albums, at least for them, like Start the Machine and We Must Obey. They're a little bit more aggressive, or at least aggressive for them. The guitar tone might sound a little bit chunkier and meatier, and there's some slightly more aggressive riffs in there. But for the most part, I would say this band definitely has more of a rock vibe. But again, because it's stoner rock, I feel like it's at least more metal adjacent, to the point where more metalheads will embrace it versus just, rock fans. And honestly, I'm kind of with that. Like, I don't necessarily think Fu Manchu is a metal band. But at the same time, if you're going to include like more stoner rock bands, because I know a lot of John Garcia's bands are on the archives, I feel like you kind of have to open the door the rest of the way to kind of let like that whole high desert stoner rock sound, and bands that are very much like close to that, like a lot of the Meteor City bands, which are just straight up Caius worship, which I know some of those are on the archives as well. But would I consider Fu Manchu a flat-out metal band? No, but I think in terms of stoner rock, like, you're not going to find much better representation in terms of the whole genre. Either way, killer band. Strongly recommend checking out their stuff. And we're going to close this one out with an interesting one that I've been wanting to go over for a while, just because, I don't know, it's probably just more known as a kind of half step between two projects. We are talking about Samhain, or Samhain, however, Glenn Danzig chose to pronounce it. I know he said Samhain in like one song, but he's also said Samhain in interviews. Whatever. This is the band we're talking about, that half step between the Misfits and Glenn Danzig's solo career. So this was a short-lived project, but I think it's a really interesting one because as it went on, it became more metal with each release. Started off definitely more close to the Misfits. Like, it was, more horror punk / death rock, or whatever Glenn was calling it at the time. Even the band's look overall was very much like the Misfits. In fact, I think in the past I've mistaken photos of Samhain for pictures of the Misfits, because, they had the greasy, weird devil lock hair, and Glenn was there, so I was like, yeah, no, it's Misfits, whatever. But I never really sat down and jammed Samhain until very recently. I picked up a box set, their giant box set, which contains all their albums, and I was always kind of curious about that band because Misfits and Danzig seem very separate, like, kind of a canyon between them in terms of how different their sound is. And this represented that weird transitional period where it kind of started off punk and then leaned more towards metal. And initially with Initium, it still was very close to the Misfits sound. It was still dark and sinister, but definitely leaned more on the punk side of things, but it was a little bit different. Glenn was actually on guitars on their first album, Initium, and I don't know, like, part of it kind of sounded more like early Killing Joke, just with Glenn Danzig fronting it, which in theory sounds all right, but honestly, this first album I thought was kind of, rough, a little bit directionless. Like, Glenn clearly had a comfort zone that he was lurking in because, punk was his thing. But at the same time, he was still experimenting and trying to evolve his sound in terms of this new project. But the following two albums, November Coming Fire and Final Descent, were definitely more metal leaning. And whether or not you consider this band metal at all, you can definitely say that it was always progressing towards metal, because November Coming Fire definitely sounds a little bit like a blend of the two. Like, it's heavier, there's still a lot of punk to it, but there's a little bit more kind of groove-based songs and just like more riffs that are like a little bit more on the metal side of the spectrum. There's a lot more experimentation on that album too, and a lot more atmosphere. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, like Misery Tomb, which is just this weird like transitional track where it's just ambient atmosphere and then what sounds like Glenn stepping on Legos in the night, like it's just in the like just out of nowhere, and it's kind of panned a little bit and harmonized, and it's dumb. It's very, very skippable. But when you get to Final Descent, that album, I would say, is a little bit more of a metal album. In fact, there's like crossover thrash moments on it. And this is where he actually got his lineup that would become the Danzig band, namely Chuck Biscuits and John Christ. There are songs that have echoes of doom metal to them, and again, the crossover songs, the Birthing and Descent in particular, they sound like Glenn Danzig fronting like Agnostic Front or Cro-Mags. It's purely like thrash metal, and kind of comes out of nowhere, because at that point I really wasn't expecting it, because every other bit of fast material that has been shown, at least at this point, even in Glenn's career, has definitely been more punk related, and that sounds way more metal. Now with this lineup also, you could hear early versions of some of like Glenn's big hits like Twisted Cane and Possession, and eventually this band would just flat out drop the name Samhain and just become Danzig. And pretty much the rest is history there, because I think most people would consider Danzig's material mostly metal, or at least the earlier stuff. I don't own any Danzig in my collection. Just never been like a huge fan, but I have Misfit stuff and I have the Samhain box set, and I kind of like the earlier stuff just because I kind of like that old gritty punk. But I don't know, at some point I'm just going to have to get some Danzig, because the evolution, at least with this step in between, I think is really interesting, because the entire career of Samhain feels like it was spent searching for a new sound, and once they found it, Samhain was dead and Danzig was essentially born. There was a certain point in there, probably around Final Descent, where he was just like, fuck it, I'm not catering to the Misfits fans anymore, I'm just gonna kind of do my own thing, and it was a huge success. As for Samhain being a metal band, I mean, honestly, I would argue that Final Descent is a metal album. It's definitely got its more punky moments on it, but for the most part, it has a more metal feel to it, and a lot of that stuff would become like Danzig material. The first two, though, I would say are still more along, the whole punk vibes, like, or death rock, or whatever the hell he was calling it. But that last one, arguably a metal album, so I don't know if that's enough to make Samhain a metal project. I would just say it's, again, a long transitional process into another band. And, well, I mean, it kind of worked. And that will wrap up this one. Again, I still have a lot of bands on this list. There's a lot of different ones to talk about. And I definitely want to do some more proto-metal stuff, because it was really cool going over those earlier bands that really helped influence metal, even though they really weren't metal. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. If you'd like to help us out there, there's a link down below to thrallsmetal.com. Our Patreon link is there. It is also on our channel up in the banner in the bottom right-hand corner. But if you're looking for Thralls Metal stuff, you have to go to thrallsmetal.com. We have t-shirts, both old and new. The old ones are discounted, provided we have your size, and we even have hats still. So if you're looking for any of that stuff, click the link down below. And of course, thank you guys so much for liking, subscribing, sharing, commenting, all that stuff. Again, it is absolutely amazing doing this, and we have a ton of content planned for you. And hopefully by now we'll have the Meshuggah ranking up, and well, we'll get down to that whole voting process as to what are the next bands we're going to cover. But outside of that, of course, a ton of reviews. I am going to be busy with collection updates for a while because of all the music I purchased down in Florida. And of course, we're going to squeeze in some States metal, and I'm working on some ideas in terms of like other discussions and topical things I want to talk about, because I don't know, it's kind of fun to just kind of get outside of the routines. But either way, thank you guys so much for all of your support, and we will catch you later.